Welcome to customizing widgets using the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. I'm Matt Driscoll. I'm going to be co-presenting with Juan Carlos Franco. Here are our handles if you want to follow us on Twitter. So on the agenda for this session, we're going to cover what you guys can customize with widgets, and we're going to talk about some different approaches to customizing and show you some demos to go along with that. So customizing widgets, what we mean is the first option will be theming a widget, and this will be changing styles, colors, sizing, font, etc. Anything to do with CSS and Sass. And then the next approach we'll be covering is altering the presentation of a widget. So this will be creating a completely new widget view or just altering a one that you are already using. And then we'll also cover extending a view, so overriding some functionality, tweaking it, or adding a functionality to it. So the customization approaches we'll be covering through this session is authoring a theme using Sass, and then recreating a view and extending a view. And both of those will be using TypeScript to do. So for part one, I'm going to turn it over to Franco, and he's going to talk about theming.
Thanks, Matt. So part one, theming. First off, why would you want to theme? Well, you might want the theme to match the branding of your company, or based on your map's content, you would like the theme to make it pop a little bit more. Or if you have user-specific requirements, or if you're working on a specific device, you might have a need for bigger buttons, for example, to make it easier to use. Before going into more details on custom themes, I just want to bring up different themes that we provide out of the box in the JS API. So there are 10 different themes that you can use. All you need to do is to reference the style sheet with the specific theme name that you want that we'll see in the first demo. And that's it. Pretty simple to bring it in. So for the out-of-the-box themes, I have this simple test app here. And it has a few widgets set up in the corners using the light theme, which is a default. But there's also a dark one. And for both the light and the dark themes, there are different color ones that you can choose from. So feel free to take a look at the samples and see which one fits your needs. Before starting to customize our theme, let's talk about the technology that we use in the JS API to produce our themes. So first off, we use Sass. And specifically, we use Node and Grunt to automate some of the steps to generate the styles or themes that we use in the API. And if you're not familiar with Sass, it's a CSS preprocessor. And it essentially powers up your CSS. It gives you some nice features to make it easy to work with. Some other benefits are that it makes it so that you can structure your styles to be modular and keep them in different files and bring them in whenever you need them, make it easier to structure. And this makes your code be drier or to avoid repeating yourself all over the place if you didn't have this. And that, coupled with some other nice features such as functions or the ability to define your own functions, makes theming way easier. So for our demo, we'll be doing a custom theme following a few steps. We'll be using a theme utility to generate some files that we'll be using to modify and then compile to create a theme that will bring it into a preview application. So going more in detail, the first step is to clone this repository for this project that will set up the styling for your custom theme. So the next step, you'll be running npm install. And what this is going to do, it's going to install all the dependencies, lay out the scaffolding for the project, and then it'll start compiling and then launch a preview app so you can see the theme, how it applies as you're making changes. I mentioned that you'll be modifying a file, and specifically you'll be modifying a main.scss file under the My Theme folder. And optionally, you can also tweak the preview page that comes with the utility if you need something more specific to your real-world application. Once this is done, it's going to produce a dist folder that you can copy over or serve, and then you just need to reference the main file that was generated. And that's all you need for your custom theme. We do this because we want to avoid writing brittle selectors that could break between releases or that won't apply consistently to all widgets. So by using Sass, it is fairly easy to just make a few changes that apply through the entire theme. So we'll be taking a closer look into some of these files in the demo, but there are a few key ones that we want to highlight, such as the ones that allow you to modify color, size, or type used in the theme. By default, no pun intended, we define all these different variables in such a way that you can always override them. So it makes it easier to customize, and then the theme just picks it up whenever it's starting to compile everything. For example, if you defined a few of these key variables, magic happens. And that magic basically means that we have structured different variables to be computed off of others, so that just by defining a few, you can have multiple be generated for you. And if you want to learn more about this, you can reference the styling page under the JS API's SDK. So let's get into our demo. For this part, we'll be creating a theme that fits our slides, as you see here. So let's get to it. So I'm running the utility in the background, and immediately what it does, it's going to launch this preview page that has a few widgets set up. And as we will be making changes, it's going to update automatically, and you'll be able to see the theme update as you make these changes. So let's go ahead and do that. And before doing that, I just want to go quickly over the structure of this project. And once you install it, what it does, it's going to lay out the Sass folder, which includes the base one where you will find different files that define variables used across the theme, as well as some utilities. So I mentioned color before. This is where we define different color variables, definitions here. Same for size and type. And we also have a folder for widgets. And then there's also an examples folder that contains the main files for different themes that we have in the JS API. So you can use these as reference to generate different themes. And it also comes with a My Theme folder, and this is the main file we'll be modifying for our demo. Before getting into the theme part, there's also a preview folder that includes a test page that we have here on the left. And whenever we make changes, it's going to compile and push them into this dist folder. And this is the folder that you'll be hosting and referencing in your application. So with that said, let's start making some changes. So I have here already some variables that I want to use for my theme. And you'll notice as soon as I start uncommenting the variables, the changes start being applied in the theme and then picked up in my application. So just by making a few changes, we already have a theme that matches the slides, which is pretty cool. But we can take this a little bit further. I can also change the sizing of the font as well as the font family if I wanted to. And if you want wanted to make this theme a little bit more touch-friendly, you can increase the default size of buttons. So just with a few changes, we get a different theme that matches our slides and fits our needs. So to recap, we showed you how to use a utility to make theming way easier. We walked through the structure of the theming utility and highlighted some of the key files that you can reference as you're making your custom theme. And we also showed how you can provide overrides and have these produce a custom theme for you. Well, this marks the end of part 1, and with that, I'll hand it back to Matt.
For part 2, we're going to talk about widget views. So widgets are composed of views and view models, and this is to keep the logic separate from the display or presentation. It allows a widget to be more reusable, and you can swap it out and replace it if you need to. And it allows for integrating a widget into a framework by just using the view model. So our widgets are written in TypeScript, which is just type JavaScript. It also gives you the benefit to write JavaScript of the future, but right now. And TypeScript is supported in all the major IDEs that are out there, like Visual Studio, etc. So views, they're the presentation of the widget. They take the view model and they use its logic to render user interface. So all the view-specific logic resides here, any presentation, stuff like that. And they extend our base widget class, which is Esri Widgets widget. So our base widget class, it provides a consistent lifecycle, and so you understand how to work with widgets, and they're all the same. Now the widget has a lifecycle. The first lifecycle method is constructor. So this is when the widget is initialized. You can put logic in here. Then there's a post initialize. So this is after it's been initialized, but before any rendering happens. Then we have render, and this is the main thing we'll be working with. This is where you define your user interface. And then destroy, where you can clean up any event handlers and things like that. So render, this is the main meat of the widget you'll be working with. This is where you set up all your user interface. It reacts to state, so any properties that you define as renderable, if they change, render will be called and it efficiently re-renders. And it uses JSX, so you'll be working with virtual DOM when you're defining the elements in here. So working with views, let's explore a view on the API. So we'll look at the ScaleRange slider. So this is the documentation reference page for the ScaleRange slider. You can see what the widget kind of looks like and does. What this widget is for is its purpose is to define a min scale and a max scale for a layer. So you'll have a range, and you can define what scale this layer is visible at. So it has like these little range markers and the max and min scale, and then it shows you a little preview image of what scale you're kind of looking at right now, so you can get an idea what it is. So here's an example of it. Right now I have this layer with some point data, and my current scale is defined by this little marker here. And so if I move this out, then the layer is then hidden. Move it back and it's shown. Also, if I zoom in and it goes out of that scale range, the layer won't be shown anymore either. And you can see what kind of scale it's at right now. So now it's back in. But if I keep going, now it disappears again. So that's a ScaleRange slider. What we're going to be doing is recreating a view, making a custom ScaleRange slider. So we'll be basically taking that widget's view model and creating this look for it. So it's a little more visual when you're picking scales. Here's what we're going to create. So we have a different scale range slider, basically, where instead of like moving a slider, you just pick an image to define that. So this is going to display from to world. So from world to neighborhood or to states. So once I get in below states, then it disappears. Or I could say maybe I'll go to city. And then eventually it should disappear. There we go. So that's what we'll be creating. But first we need to kind of design up how our widget's going to work by creating this interface. So our widget is going to have a property for setting a layer. And this is what layer is going to be, where the min scale and the max scale is going to be set on. Then we're going to have a range type. And this is so we know what tab we're going to be working with, whether it's to or from. Then we're going to have a region. And this is to get the thumbnails out of a specific region. For our purposes, we'll just keep this to US for United States. Then we'll have the view. And this is where you define either a map view or a scene view that you're working with. And then the view model, and this is going to handle the logic, and this will be using a scale range slider view model. So with that, we can get started. So right now, let's look at the setup of our app. We have an index file, and we set up a package for our demo, and it's going to look in the app folder. And then we're just requiring our main TypeScript file here. And what we've done there is we've created a map view. We're going to use a feature layer, a map, and this custom scale range is the widget we're going to be creating. So we set up our layer from a portal item. We set up our map, set up our view, and then we set up our widget, and we pass in the view property, the layer property, we set the region, and we position our widget, our custom widget, in the view by using CSS. So if we go into the start of our widget, right now it's just kind of like a shell of a widget. We're importing a few decorators from Accessor. We have our widget base class. We have our TypeScript support for the widget. And then we create our custom scale range widget, which is going to extend the widget base class. We have our simple lifecycle constructor. We've defined a render method, but all it's doing is logging out the instance of the widget and creating a virtual DOM div. So pretty basic. So if we look at what we've got so far, this is it. We're just logging out the instance, so I can take a look at that, and I see that the widget has a container. It has an icon, ID. There's no view model yet, and it's got a label custom scale range. So pretty much a basic shell of it. We're going to make this into a custom view now. So the first thing we're going to want to do is add some properties to our widget. And we'll add a layer property, because we know we need that. We're already passing it in, but we're not doing anything with it. So this is going to be using a property decorator. And what that does basically is it uses a decorator from Accessor, and it allows me to set things and watch things on the widget. And this property is going to be an alias property, which means it's basically just going to pass this property to the view model, and that will handle the logic of this property. Next thing I need to do is import the layer dependency. So we're just going to say, it's going to take any Esri layer. So that's defined. Then we want to set up our properties for the range type and the region. So the range type, we define this as to and from, and this is going to be a renderable property. And what that means is anytime this property changes or is modified, it's going to call the render method on the widget. So this is another decorator from widget. It's renderable. And we need to define what range type is. So we're just going to set up a TypeScript type and say it can be either from or to. Cool. And then we have our region, which is also renderable because it defines the thumbnail that's going to be displayed. And we're just going to set it to have a default of US. Now we want to set up the view and the view model properties. So view is going to be another alias property. So the logic is going to be handled in the view model, where it's going to pass this property along. And it can be a map view or a scene view, and by default it's going to be just null. So let's define those. Got to import the references to map view and scene view. Cool, imported those. And the next property is going to be our view model, and this is also going to be a renderable property, but this one's going to re-render anytime any one of these changes. So if the view model state changes, we want to re-render. If the scale ranges change, or the min scale or max scale changes, we want to re-render. And this is going to be a type of ScaleRange slider view model, so we need to import that. Back up to the top. So this is our view model. It's going to handle all the logic for our widget. Cool. And we should be compiling. So I have it set up to watch TypeScript and recompile. So everything should be recompiling now. And if I look at the instance now, and I look at the view model, it's an object, and I can see those properties I just defined in, like layer. We got the max scale. Yeah, so view model's set up. We got our range type. We got our region, and we have our view too. So cool. So those properties are all set up. Now it's time to take on the rendering. So the render method. First thing is I created this CSS object, CSS map object of all the classes I'm going to be using in the render method. And here I'm using the BEM methodology for naming, and that stands for block element modifier. It's just a methodology for creating class names to ensure specificity. So for example, this will be the block, this is the element, and this is the modifier. Cool, so we're going to use those in the render methods. So let's update our render method now. So right now we just are creating a div and logging out the instance. We're going to change that. Oops. Change that. So that we are getting the view model as a reference here, the view, and we're going to create two lists. The first one is going to be a list for the tabs, and we're going to render the tabs in there. And then we're going to create a list for the thumbnails. So those thumbnails for each scale range. And then depending on the view model state, we're going to render those lists, or we're not going to render anything. And we're still returning a div, but we have a class on there now. So yeah. So that's our updated render method, but now we need to actually create these two private protected methods there. So we'll create them to be just empty right now so we can compile. So I'm just going to put these right here. Now it'll recompile. Cool, so no errors, that's good. If we look at our demo, not going to really see much, but we can see if we go into the view, user interface, our manual container, we have our custom ScaleRange div there, and we have our two lists, but they're just empty right now. So cool, we're seeing those changes. So let's start making the tabs for the render. So we want our tabs to have two tabs, and they're going to be from and to. So for each of those, we're going to render a tab item. So let's create that. And I'm making these protected methods so that they can be overridden by a user if they want to customize one of these and tweak the look of it a little bit. So now we're creating our render tab item protected method, and this is going to create a list item, and it's going to render a button inside of that. So let's do that. Cool. And then we create our button, and it's going to use the range type. It's going to create a button with a couple of classes on it, whether or not it's active or not, and then just the text of it inside. So that's compiling now. We can check it and see how it's looking. So now we have our tabs, but clicking them doesn't do anything. So we just have tabs rendered there. So what we want to do is we want to set up an on-click for these tabs. So on the button, when it's clicked, I want to set the range type. So I'll need to create a private method to do that. So go into our section for private methods. And all that's going to do is change the range type to the new type. So now, if I go back in here, reload, I can click on the tabs and it sets the active tab. Cool. So now we need to start building our thumbnail list. So right now we just have this empty protected method. So we're going to change that. And instead of just an empty nothing, we're going to create thumbnails. So we're going to get every even scale range. Because there's 20 of them, I'm just going to render 10. We're going to render a thumbnail for each one of those. So let's create that method. And the thumbnail is just going to be a list item with a button inside of it as well. Let's create that one. So the thumbnail button, we're going to get the scale from the view model. We're going to see if it's active, and we're going to create classes based on the status of that. And we've set up an on-click just to console log the scale right now. And then inside of this button that we're going to render, we're going to put the label for it. So let's create that method. And so to get the label, we're going to use the current widget's existing I to N locale strings. So we need to import this, and then we're going to use that inside of a div as a label. So let's import the widget's I to N. So all of our widgets, they're localized in almost 40 languages. So we can take advantage of that by using the strings for the widget already. So we're just going to reuse those. So cool. We got that set up. So we're rendering our thumbnail label. Let's take a look at how that's looking now. So now we're seeing our tabs and we're seeing our thumbnail here, but they don't have any background image yet. But we do have the labels for each one of them. And clicking on them, I can just get the scale that they would set. So making progress. Now we're going to add thumbnails to the thumbnail buttons. So first we want to do is we want to import some dependencies. So the existing widget has a couple of helper methods to get a thumbnail image and then get the background position of it because it uses a sprite. So we're going to import those, and then we're going to go back to where we're creating our thumbnail button, and we're going to create a CSS style for the button. So I'm creating a style with a background image and a background position using those two helper methods I just talked about. And then what I'm going to do is set the styles on the button using this, and that will apply CSS styles to it. So now we send out backgrounds. Sweet. But clicking it doesn't do what we want yet. So we need to work on that. So let's add some on-click to these buttons. So instead of the console logging, let's change it to call a method set scale to if it's in the range type of 2, or set scale from if it's not. So we'll create those private methods. And what these methods are going to do is just set the view model's min scale and max scale to whatever scale we want to be set. Cool. And the last thing we need to do is add a watch utils for when the layers min scale, or the view model's min scale and max scale is changed. So we're going to import watch utils, which is just a utility to watch a property and then call some kind of function. And then we're going to add a post-initialize lifecycle. And what we're going to do in here is we're going to watch the view model's min scale. And if the min scale changes, we're going to get that value and set it on the view model's layer as the min scale. And we're going to do the exact same thing for the max scale as well. Cool. Let's take a look at our widget. So now I can click on one of these and it's changing the scale, and I can see that the layer goes away when I'm not in that scale range. But if I zoom in, it's going to reappear. Cool. So that 2 is working, or the from's working, and the 2, let's say right now it's to street. Let's make it city. So if I go past city, it disappears. Street, and then it's back. Cool. So that's our widget. We made it. So recap what we did. What have we learned about widget views? Well, we learned that they're the face of the widget. They present the view model's logic. This separation allows it's easier to integrate into a framework or create a totally custom view because the view model logic is still there and separate. And I didn't talk about this, but the view model, the view and the styles are on the documentation. So if you want to download those and see them, you just click the link and you'll be taken to GitHub where you can see the source code for the view. So it's a lot easier to look at and customize when you see the source code. So that's the end of part 2. For part 3, I'm going to turn it back over to Franco, and he's going to talk about extending a view.
So for part 3, we'll be covering extending a view. So first off, why would you want to do this? Well, we already have the widget or the view, so why not reuse it and apply our changes on top of it? We can also avoid bringing any other dependencies to make our changes, so we can stay in the same ecosystem. How are we going to do this? Well, we'll be leveraging the base widget class that you saw with Matt, and by revisiting the API of some of the widget views that you saw. So for this part, we'll also be extending the ScaleRange slider. And if you remember, you can access via the SDK a link to see the source code for that widget view. So for the ScaleRange slider, you can check out the source code and see how it works. This is really useful because it gives you some insight in how our widgets work. So for our demo, we'll be focusing on 2 parts. One will be changing or modifying the rendering part, like the visual part of the widget, and the other one will be more functional. Before that, let's take a look at the start of our demo. So if you don't remember, this is the ScaleRange slider, which you saw in Matt's demo as well. And I want to call out this little icon that shows the current scale you're in. So as you zoom in and zoom out, it's going to update its position along the slider. So for our first part, we're going to be modifying that. And as I mentioned before, you can look at the source code on GitHub. And it so happens that I know the part that actually renders this little icon for the indicator. So I'll be providing an override for that rendering. So let's start our demo. First off, I want to look into my index page, and all that I'm doing here is importing some styles, the JS API along with some configuration, and then a div for my view and the application. If I look into my application, it's a pretty simple one where I'm setting up a map and I'm setting up a widget, my custom ScaleRange slider widget. And as I'm making changes to the sliders, it's going to update the layer. If you remember, the slider is pretty much the same one from the API. And that's because if we take a look at the file, we'll see that all I'm doing is extending the ScaleRange slider widget. So let's start by overriding the rendering of the current scale indicator icon. So all I'm doing here is providing an override to that rendering method. And all it's doing is it's creating a div with a CSS class applied to it, as well as an emoji, because I like emojis. And TypeScript is complaining because I'm referencing an object that I have not defined. So I can go ahead and take care of that. And all I'm doing is I'll be using the CSS lookup that you saw in Matt's demo as well. This pattern we use to keep track of all of our classes. And all I'm doing is using it to apply a custom CSS selector. So I've already defined some styles, but let's take a look at our demo here. And you can see the indicator is now different. It's now an emoji. And we keep the same behavior because we're using the same widget, right? That was easy. So now for the behavior part, what I'll be doing is I will be updating the widget so that whenever you click on any of the thumbs, it'll take you to that scale. So whenever you click on it right now, nothing happens because it's not part of the widget itself. So let's go ahead and change that. So I went ahead and created this method that does it for us, and it's leveraging the widget's lifecycle. And all I'm doing here is when post initialize is called in the widget's lifecycle, it's going to initialize this widget using the ScaleRange sliders post initialize method. And then I'm going to set up some event handlers. The first one, it's whenever the widget container is clicked. I'm going to explain the dragging logic in a few, but for now, all that it's doing is it's checking if the clicked node is a thumb. And if it is, it's going to determine which scale to go to based on which thumb it is. And for the dragging part, I have this other event handler here that whenever the slider is emitting a thumb drag event, I'm going to set dragging to true to ignore any potential clicks that I don't want to pay attention to. So this means whenever I move the slider around and if a click is triggered, I want to ignore that. I just want to pay attention to whenever a click happens on a thumb without moving it first. So TypeScript now is complaining because I have not defined some imports here, but also because I'm referencing some variables that are not defined. And these variables are inside of the widget because I was able to look into the source code and kind of determine that that is defined there and I can use it. So I can work around this in TypeScript by defining an interface to access the internals. And what I'm doing here is I'm extending the custom ScaleRange slider interface or the class to let TypeScript know that I'll be accessing a slider instance and the thumb elements that are stored as part of the widget. I also add some imports here for the event listening and the type for the slider. That's pretty much it. So now if I go to my application and refresh, if I click after I move the thumb, it's going to zoom to that scale. So a quick way of checking out the different scales. All right, to recap, we were able to extend an existing widget by reusing its view and view model APIs. We were able to do so by just writing a little bit of TypeScript and using the JS API. We didn't need to bring anything additional to make these changes. And we also were able to make these changes because we understood the lifecycle of the widget and by writing a little bit of TypeScript. All right, so that's the end of part 3. So to conclude, we showed you how to author a theme using a Sass-based approach. We showed you how to recreate a view by leveraging an existing view model and its APIs to create a view from scratch. And we also showed you how to take an existing view and extend it and add more functionality or different rendering. Here are some additional resources that you can check out once you check the slides, and there will be a link at the end. Here are a few sessions that you might be interested in that cover other topics that might be beneficial, such as getting started with the JS API, working with TypeScript, tips and tricks for debugging and developing your apps, as well as more on creating your own widget. For questions, if you want to check out the slides or source, we have a bit.ly link. It's bit.ly/builtwidgetsds20. That'll take you to a repository for this presentation along with the demos. So feel free to check that out. And if you want to submit a question, there's a bit.ly link as well, bit.ly/askjsapi. And this will take you to GeoNet where you can post questions. And that is it. Thank you so much.